Let's talk about how guns work. Hi, my name's Ray. I'm a firearms instructor from Chicago. My pronouns are they, them. So one of the ways that we can differentiate different types of firearms is by their action. The action on a gun basically says what the trigger does. Most people would think, oh, the trigger just fires the gun. That's correct, but how it does that mechanically differs from gun to gun. There are basically three main categories. There are single action, double action, and combination double action, single action pistols. In front of me here, I have three replicas. These are not real firearms that mimic how an actual semi-automatic firearm works, and I'm going to walk through each of the three categories. So the first type of firearm we're going to talk about is a single action. In these types of guns, the trigger performs one and only one function, and that function is dropping the hammer onto the round to cause it to fire. That means that the hammer needs to be cocked manually one of two ways. The first way is pulling it back manually with your thumb. At that point, the trigger can release the hammer. The second way is by pulling the slide back and then letting it travel forward. This will also cock the hammer. It'll become important when we talk about the firing cycle later. Keep in mind that to get a round from the magazine into the chamber, you will need to rack the slide at least once, so there's no real effective way to get a round in the chamber without also cocking the hammer. Let's walk through kind of how that works by loading the magazine and seeing how this gun fires in practice. These guns use a gas blowback system, so it's going to replicate how a firearm actually works, but these are not loaded with any sort of projectile, so nothing is going to come out when I pull the trigger. Right now, we haven't yet pulled the slide back, even though we did insert the magazine. So that means if we pull the trigger, nothing is going to happen. Remember, on a single action, the trigger only drops the hammer. It does not cock the hammer. So by racking the slide and chambering around, we can now pull the trigger. You'll notice firing around caused the slide to go backwards and forwards, and that also cocked the hammer again. That means that we can keep firing over and over and over again, and the gun will continue to have a cocked hammer until the magazine is exhausted of ammunition, at which point the slide will lock in the rearward position so a new magazine can be loaded. Single action guns are good for competition or precision shooting because the trigger only performs one mechanical action. It makes the trigger pull lighter and easier to actually fire the gun without exercising a lot of control that's going to affect your grip. The next type of firearm is double action. On a double action firearm, the trigger performs two mechanical functions. The first part of the trigger travel is going to cock the hammer, and then the second part is going to release the hammer, just like we saw in single action. On most double action pistols, the hammer is going to be entirely inside of the frame of the gun and not visible from the outside. There's no real interaction that we have manually with the hammer. We just trust that the trigger is going to do its job every single time. So let's see what that looks like. We can load our magazine into the gun, and then every time we pull the trigger after racking the slide, it will keep firing, and we don't actually have to interact with the hammer at all. Double action guns tend to have a much heavier trigger pull than a single action, and a lot of people view this as a kind of safety feature. Because the trigger has to perform two mechanical actions, and one of those is under spring tension, it makes it harder to pull the trigger and less likely that you'll fire the gun by accident. The third type of firearm we may encounter is a combination double action, single action. On these guns, you can select between double action or single action depending on what you want. Let's take a look at one of these. So you can tell that this gun is a double action, single action by the presence of the decocking lever. This lever allows you to drop the hammer after it's been cocked to put the gun in double action mode. Let's run through a couple firing cycles and see what that actually looks like in practice. So just like we saw in the single action, racking the slide does also cock the hammer, but through the use of the decocking lever, we can drop the hammer back down. Once we've loaded a magazine and racked the slide, this shot is going to be in single action. If I pull the trigger, the same thing that happens in a single action gun happens here. The slide moves back from the firing of the round, and the hammer is cocked. If I hit the decocking lever, the trigger comes forward into the double action position, and when I pull the trigger, the hammer will go back down. A lot of people like these double action, single action firearms for self-defense purposes. You can imagine that if you were carrying a gun in a holster, you would want it to be double action so that you don't fire the gun accidentally. With that long, heavy trigger pull, it's less likely that you're going to accidentally fire the gun. But subsequent shots will drop the hammer from the racking of the slide and cause those shots to be in single action mode, which makes it easier to fire and easier to aim. By using the decocking lever, we can decide whether the gun should be in the double action heavy trigger pull mode or the single action easy trigger pull mode. You can also cock the hammer manually to put it in single action mode as well. And that's all there is to it. As always, I hope you learned something, and if I missed anything, don't be afraid to let me know.